Hi everyone. In this short video, I'm going to briefly discuss the excerpt of the essay that I assigned from Bruce Jackson called "The Story Is True." I'm going to use it just to use this video just to kind of give you a quick walkthrough of how he structures a discussion of an example and his analysis of it as well, as a mirror for you to see how you can quote, or one option that you have in quoting evidence from your portfolio and comparing it to that same evidence in an earlier version from an earlier draft, and just walk you through how that should be structured in the same way that in the sound video I walked you through how the analysis of the poem could be structured by introducing the poem and telling its story, and then also separating the analysis of the stanzas one by one. So this will be similar to that. And in order to do so, I'm just going to pull up a quick worksheet where I've laid out some 6 elements of the draft, and we'll pull up the essay as well and kind of walk through it. And this will just help you, guide you as you structure your portfolio introduction evidence. So let's see. Okay, so here's the 2 things. We have this excerpt, and then we have my little note sheet here. So, as mentioned, this is an example of quoted evidence and analysis. Now, it is important to note that Bruce Jackson is not writing a portfolio introduction. He is not making an argument about how he's grown as a writer, and he's also making a comparison between the way he tells the story and the way that someone else tells the story. So there's another person involved. It's not just singularly focused on him. So those are important notes to make at the beginning, but it's still a good example of how to structure this kind of evidence and analysis. So what this is doing for us is showing how to use 2 quotes to show how you improved from the first to the second. And it's one of your options in quoting. I think I've said before, if you were trying, for example, to develop your audience and problem making in the second draft of the In Defense of essay, and it wasn't quite working, it wasn't quite right just yet. But then in your third draft and final draft, your problem making and audience was really good. You might want to show me, your audience, these quotes together to literally contrast and show me how you grew from one to the next. And that might be a persuasive way to show me that you've grown in skill. So we're going to look at Jackson's structure here. What he does, and I'll just walk through it, and then we'll go to the pages and see him doing it, is he first wants to introduce both versions of the evidence. This is, of course, after he has kind of set the topic that he's going to discuss. He's talking about the effect of different versions of a story and how details matter, and he kind of gives us that in the very beginning before he says, and now an example. So then, before the example, specifically the quotes start, he kind of introduces that he's going to talk about 2 versions of the evidence, a story he's told and a story that Peter Fonda has told. So this is kind of like context, just giving me, your reader, some context to understand the quote that's going to come by. So after he introduces both versions of the evidence, or that he will present both versions, he goes on to introduce the first version of the evidence. He tells a little bit of a story about where he told this story, what the situation was. And so again, that's just given some context. And that's what we've talked about as the example mode of discourse for this portfolio introduction. After he does that, he explains, which we call analysis, the meaning or purpose of the first piece of evidence. So he's talking about what the effect of the writing and the writing style was. Now for you, unlike for him, you're going to be talking about where this first version of the evidence was still lacking, where it still wasn't fully working, where it wasn't fully polished and effective yet. He doesn't do that, because he's not doing the same thing you're doing. But this would be the place where you explain the purpose of the evidence, or in this case, the success of the evidence. In this quote, you can see that my development of the audience and problem making was lacking because of these things, so on and so forth. After he's done that, then he transitions, and in doing so, sets a new context into the second version of the evidence, with note that it is different. He just points out that it's different. So that's part of telling the story too. Here's the next bit of evidence, here's the next story, and it is going to be different. It's going to, in this case, or in your case, it's going to be better than the first. After he does that, he then explains and analyzes the changes made between the two versions. And in doing so, he's just showing the differences and how they have different effects. But for you, you would be showing how your second version is more successful and analyzing how it's more successful than the first version. And then he ends with a deeper explanation of the effects of the changes on the purpose of each version. So again, that's kind of like a conclusion, wrapping up the analysis that he does at the end. This is a really good structure for you. You might want to screenshot this while it's here, so that then as you go back and reread Jackson, you can kind of look at each section and where he's doing this. So I'll give you 1 second to take a screenshot, and then we'll move on and just work through his draft and see where this is happening. Okay. So first, we want to see where he introduces both versions of the evidence. So he says right here, an example. So he's already said what he's going to talk about. He's already made his claim and defined his claim, and then he's going to go into example and evidence. He says, I gave the keynote address at a session on gunfighter westerns at this 1976 Sun Valley Institute on Arts and Humanities conference celebrating 75 years of Western films. Story. Right. The session was chaired by the actor Peter Fonda. When I was done with my presentation, Peter told a story about his father that I often tell when I'm trying to describe the way artists relate to their work. It's probably my favorite representative anecdote about artistic sensibility. And he's introduced that Peter Fonda tells the story, he tells the same story. It just gives us some context. Context is this conference and this particular time, and so on and so forth. Now we're going to move then into his introduction to the first version of the evidence. And it's short, but it's still there. He says, here's a transcript of the way I told the story at a recent lecture, which happened to be tape recorded. You see, he quotes the evidence for the reader to see in full. And then he moves on to, as we said, explain the meaning or purpose of the evidence. He says that's what artistic sensibility is all about. The artist doing things at the level of the consumer of the art will never consciously notice, but will feel at the level and in the place where the work really matters. The audience will never notice that, no, but they'll feel it. I just love it. Every time I've told the story, people have nodded their heads in agreement, getting the point immediately. So he's analyzing the point. The point of the story is to make a certain idea known, and it has this effect on the audience where they agree and everyone loves it. So he's done these first three things here. Now he needs to transition into the second version, and he does that with this paragraph here. We don't need to read it, but he basically just says he wanted to make sure that he had Peter's story right, so he listened to the tape and then he realized, wow, it's going to be different. And he quotes then, after he introduces Peter Fonda's version of the story, he introduces the full quote and gives the full quote. And so he's transitioned, he's noted that it's different. And then the rest of the essay is going to be an explanation or analysis of the changes between the two versions and their effect. And we don't need to go into that, but he first, in these first couple paragraphs, talks about what the differences are. And then he starts going into the effect of the differences, starting particularly with For Me. He starts talking about the different impact on the different detailed choices. This is another good example for you, not just to show your growth between one version of evidence and another, but also to point out that as you analyze that evidence, you want to focus on specifics. You don't want general statements like, no, just look at this version versus this version and you'll see the second is better. No, you got to pick out the differences. Peter or not, Bruce Jackson says, okay, look at the ants, look at the ants. Okay, what about substance? So I changed this. This is different. It's these changes that have and make different effects, and you want to focus on those. So you have the screenshot of this. You have this essay to read again. It's a great example of how to use two of your own quotes, two pieces of evidence from your own writing to show how you improved from the first to the second. Now, technically, you don't just have to do this within the same assignment. Maybe in the indefensive essay, you're still struggling, for instance, to really develop audience and problem making. But then in the How Does a Poet Make Meaning essay, specifically the final draft, you just got it down and it's really polished and good. You can compare the final draft problem-making section of the indefensive essay to the final draft problem-making section of the How Does a Poet Make Meaning. That would be fine too. Just whatever you think is going to best represent your growth as a writer. And again, this is just one way to quote. You don't have to do the comparison, but this is just a good model text to show you how. If you didn't want to do the comparison, you can still just imagine what it's like to quote some text and then analyze why it's so good by looking at the specific elements in it. So that's it for this video, and for the videos this week. Let's see, put these away. I'll be back next week with just two last videos. One to talk about the conclusion section of the portfolio introduction by reading the two Dennis Denby essays, give you some ideas about what the importance or impact or effect or benefit of rhetoric and writing and reading are. And then also one last video to talk about some final things you need to do before the course ends. So until I see you next week, have a good time. All right, bye.